Thank you all for being here. This is definitely an area of passion of mine. In addition to my work at PCH, I also work for a neurodiversity-affirmative therapy practice where I work with a lot of autistic adults. And so my understanding of autism has very much been shaped by working with actual autistic adults. And I very much integrate that into my work with assessment. So learning goals for today, we're wanting to redefine autism through a neurodiversity affirmative lens, being able to explain how autism can be conceptualized beyond the idea of a deficit model, recognize autism in high masking individuals, and be able to select autism assessment tools for affirming practice. So wanted to start with some neurodiversity affirmative vocabulary, starting with what it even means to be neurodiversity affirmative, right? And so it's the idea that we are valuing and supporting people with different neurotypes, different ways of processing the world, different ways that their brain operates, and seeing that as a natural variation in human diversity, ultimately a good thing, rather than seeing it as just because it's the minority as a deficit or a disorder that needs to be fixed or cured or changed. Right? So we're looking to adapt resources for people who are neurodivergent rather than telling them that they need to look exactly like what we call neurotypical people. And so in that, a big component is using identity-based language. And a lot of people may have heard kind of using the opposite of saying like a person with autism to kind of like separate the autism from the personhood. And it turns out that within the autistic community, people actually prefer what we call identity first language, where we're not separating out the idea of autism from the human being, that there isn't this part that we want to kind of remove from the person. And that, you know, we don't say a person with homosexuality. We don't say a person with blackness, right? When it's an integral, respected part of the identity, it comes first, right? And so, yeah.
I take pictures of these, or do you have handouts?
Feel free to take pictures. Well, yeah.
And the slides will be, but feel free to take pictures.
Oh,
Yeah.
but the slides you're gonna.
Yeah, we'll put the whole recording on YouTube.
Oh, cool.
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you.
So yes, autism is not a bad word. Saying that someone is autistic is not a bad thing, right? And we're wanting to shift this perspective from autism as a disorder to autism as a distinct neurotype. Also, another thing is functioning labels. You may have heard in the past referring to someone as kind of having low functioning autism or high functioning autism. And we're moving away from that kind of vocabulary because it sort of defines someone based on their productivity or ability to be independent, which really is not a personhood. And it also is reductive in a way that doesn't accurately reflect the experience of the person. And so there may be, we'll see this later, there may be some areas where someone is very able to integrate into sort of wider society to function, and then other areas where it's much harder. And so that kind of gets lost if you just sort of label someone high or low functioning. And so instead, we may refer to high or low support needs, to being a high masker, someone who masks their autistic traits more avidly. And so that's something, we want to be conscious of those labels. We also don't want to refer to people as normal versus autistic, right? And so we refer to them as neurotypical, or allistic, means not autistic, or just saying not autistic, right? Additionally, something to be mindful of is using euphemisms, right? This idea of calling people handy capable or differently abled can sometimes minimize the lived experience of having a disability. And that we don't want to minimize to say, this is just this kind of cutesy thing that we don't really need to acknowledge that it is disabling to live in a world that's designed for neurotypical people when you are not neurotypical, right? Some autistic people even find the euphemism of like on the spectrum to be problematic, in that it's sort of avoiding the word autism. It's sort of implying that there's something to distance from that. But again, it's really up to the people who carry this to talk about the vocabulary that they're familiar with, and so, or that is comfortable for them. And so we always refer to the people who have this identity as the ones who get to determine how it's used, but just some vocabulary to kind of think about. I've also put some here. You know, we don't want to overly PC our world, right? But we may want to think about how we use words that are powerful in how we may write up a report about someone who we're diagnosing with autism, things like that, or even how we speak about them, right? The difference between calling something rigidity when it's a preference for sameness, it's a preference for consistency. That's how the world works. You know, calling something picky versus like having a discriminating palate. Stubbornness being reconceptualized as assertiveness or persistence. So just kind of thinking through, how are the things that we assume to be kind of like negatives in some way, how can we shift this to be more strengths-based? So what is autism? We're even talking about that from the beginning. So a lot of this presentation is going to focus on what autism really is, because there's no measure that assesses for autism more effectively than a clinician who really knows what autism looks like and knows how it looks in different people who, you know, may present in more subtle ways. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about is, what are we really looking at here? And that's your biggest tool for being able to assess autism accurately. So it's a neurodevelopmental difference, which means it is something that's present from birth, even though it may not be detectable until much later in life. It may be something where we see traits very early on that people learn to mask or cover up, or it may be the opposite, where people kind of hold it together, kind of camouflage for a lot of their life. And then when they hit the social challenges of middle school or high school or even college, suddenly it starts to crumble and you start to see these traits emerge. So it is genetically heritable. And it's largely characterized by hyperconnectivity in different areas of the brain, as well as hypoconnectivity, so less connectivity within other areas. And so while we see these general patterns, there are lots of different genes associated with it in different people. There are lots of different ways of experiencing brain connectivity. And so it's different depending on the person, but it is characterized by processing the world in a careful, systematic, bottom-up way. And so it's kind of taking in the world, kind of details first, right? Where each element is analyzed separately and deliberately. It requires a lot of time and energy to do so, right? You think of it as easily activated neurons. And so autistic brains don't discriminate as readily between something that's kind of like a nuisance variable, something that we can kind of filter out, versus the things that are really important and need our attention. And so that results in sometimes being distracted by a meaningless stimulus or not picking up on a really meaningful stimulus. Strong focus on details rather than the big picture. Being very deeply and deliberately analytical, thinking methodically rather than efficiently. So not taking the shortcut. And that can have strengths and weaknesses, right? One study found that when presented with a very simple problem, I think it's if a baseball and a bat together cost $1.10 and the bat costs $1, how much does the ball cost? And 80% of neurotypicals get this wrong because they take the shortcut and say, okay, if one's $1 and the total is $1.10, it's 10 cents. It takes an extra step to process. Well, no, it's $1 more. So one is $1, the other is 5 cents. Together, it creates that. So, there's a lot of accuracy in that kind of bottom-up processing, but it takes a lot more deliberation. It's not, using the gut instinct. It's not what's necessarily intuitive, and that can be exhausting. And so often characterized by coping with unpredictability by analyzing experiences for patterns and memorizing rule sets. And so we see this, according to the CDC, in 2.8% of children. But there are a lot of issues with access to diagnosis. And so we don't see as much diagnosis across different races, across lower socioeconomic statuses. And definitely there's a huge disparity in gender. And so males are, at this point, 3 times more likely to be diagnosed. It used to be 4. A big issue with access to diagnosis is also that DSM criteria focuses entirely on external behaviors. It's about what the other person perceives as problematic or what's even occurring in the first place, and not on the internal experience of the person. And that's where accurate autism assessment really has to focus on what does the person experience, what are they experiencing internally, and not just what they're showing externally. Okay. So what do we mean when we refer to autism as a spectrum? I think this is kind of the stereotype that a lot of people think of like someone who's like kind of quirky, has like, you know, a little bit here and there, to someone who is very, very autistic. And this is really, this kind of linear perspective of the spectrum is really how we don't want to be thinking about autism. It's not you're a little bit autistic or you're really, really autistic. We want to think more about it as a spectrum that encompasses all of these different traits, and some of them may be more significant for different people. And even within the same person, some of these traits may be activated at different times. And so when we talk about this spectrum, it's sort of the spectrum of traits that can be experienced at any one time. And so this is a big reason for advocacy against functioning labels, right? We, you know, someone may be very high functioning in terms of, let's say they're executive functioning, that they're able to be on time for places, show up to jobs, do really well getting a job. They may do really well with relationships where they have kind of more neurotypical patterns of communicating, but they may feel such intense emotional dysregulation or sensory sensitivities that when you're not seeing them at their job, they're just in a breakdown mode at all times, right? And so is it really fair to call that person high functioning? It kind of takes away their internal experience of how difficult it is to operate in the world. So, you know, for some people, they may really, really focus on something and have a hard time shifting their attention away in a given moment. And then in other moments, everything is a distraction, right? And so it's like you see these traits manifest in different ways, not only across different individuals, but within the same person, depending on the day, right? So important to think about the spectrum in this kind of more trait-based circular kind of way where we're thinking about, you know, traits out here versus here, as opposed to a linear, either you're a little bit or very much. I want to bring up the concept of masking and camouflaging up front, because as we go through the diagnostic criteria, I think it's going to be really important to keep in mind that there's very much this idea that people along the way kind of learn ways that society may benefit them for emulating neurotypical traits. And so especially with people with average to higher intelligence, especially with women, we find people who tend to mask their traits or camouflage them. And that may be, you know, that's something that we all do to some extent, right? We all sometimes cover up the way that we're feeling or adjust our behavior to suit a situation that we think will benefit us in some way. But autistic people are doing it more frequently, more intensely. And it does carry its its drawbacks, right? And so you can see this cycle here of, I want people to like me, I want to fit in. So I have to do what they expect of me. So I mask, I cover up traits. But in doing so, it takes a lot of energy and I can't look after myself or meet my own needs. And so I burn out and I go into crisis and then I withdraw from others. But I want people to like me. And so I mask more. And so we see this kind of cycle, right? And similarly, we think about autism not as something to treat in and of itself, but the trauma that comes from being an autistic person within the context of a neurotypical world. And much of that is the experience of having some kind of negative, often social interaction, looking for ways to improve or cover up in the future, blaming the self, feeling like I'm the problem, becoming hypervigilant, not wanting to get things wrong again, creates a lot of anxiety, right? We see a lot of anxiety from the stress of how am I supposed to interact in this given situation, and depression about what's wrong with me that I can't, that things don't come as easily to me as other people and things like that. And so it's kind of this combination of awareness of what the should of the social interaction is with it not coming intuitively. And so it's like constantly, it's like doing math in your head all day, right? Of constantly having to calculate what's expected of me in this moment. How am I portraying that? And am I doing it right? How are other people responding? And that's absolutely exhausting. And so it's this balance of, yes, we have to get by in the social world. And the reality is that people receive a lot of reinforcement for masking because it is seen as desirable within a neurotypical context, right? But it's exhausting, right? And so we have to be really aware as we are evaluating if someone does, exhibit autistic traits, are they an adept masker? Right? So going to go through kind of DSM criteria here to kind of walk you through how you may be thinking about assessing these traits. And so our first criteria is differences in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. You're going to see, for those of you who are familiar with DSM criteria, I have changed some phrasing here. DSM does refer to these as deficits across social communication. I'm going to talk about it in terms of differences, right? That it's only seen as a deficit in the context of fewer people have their brain organized this way and process the world this way. And so we're thinking about this as a difference, not a deficit. So within this first domain, the individual has to meet all three of the criteria that I'm going to walk you through. And so the first is in terms of social emotional reciprocity. And reciprocity is about the back and forth of social interaction. Can be thought of kind of like picking up the conversational ball. When someone brings up a conversation topic, can you keep the ball rolling? Do you know how to kind of add on to what they're saying and give kind of your own take on it to keep the conversation going? Are you picking up social breadcrumbs? If someone says, oh, the weirdest thing happened to me last night, do you follow up and say, what happened, right? And so, and that's a very kind of obvious example, but it's are you picking up those social breadcrumbs? As opposed to the tendency to info dump, of just kind of talking about perhaps a topic of interest, talking about sort of from a single perspective, talking about something in that regard. Autistic people often find small talk pointless or exhausting. They're not really, why are we bothering talking about the weather, talking about what you did over the weekend? Let's get to the point, right? Let's have an honest interaction. This covers sort of intuitively greeting people and responding to greetings. Dr. Donna Henderson, who's an expert in this area, tells this great story of a very, very intelligent girl who is on the hiking trail, and her mom kind of explains, like, yeah, when you're hiking, you kind of like say hi, say good morning to everyone that you pass. And she's not doing that. And so the mom kind of informs her that, right? And then they're in the grocery store and they run into someone that they hadn't seen in a while. And the mom stops and says hello, and the daughter kind of keeps walking. And so then the mom brings it up with her later. It's like, why didn't you say hi to that person? And she's like, well, I haven't seen her in a while. And mom's like, well, that's even more reason to talk and say hi to that person. And so the daughter's thinking about it and then says, okay, so we say hi to everyone on the hiking trail, right? So like, do you do that in the grocery store? And the mom's like, well, no, that would be weird, right? And so then the daughter is putting together, wait, so you say hi to everyone on the hiking trail, but only people you know in the grocery store, and especially if you haven't seen them in a while, and just bursts into tears, right? Because who told you all of these rules that come intuitively to people who are neurotypical, but this all has to be put together with autism, right? Sharing personal information, right? Like bringing forth personal information, showing interest in other people, being able to take another's point of view, especially in situations that they are involved in. And so you might talk to a parent who says, oh yeah, she very much empathizes with other people, can understand their perspective, but it's much harder when the autistic person is involved in the situation and have to remove their own perspective and take another's in that. Right? And so it's like these little subtleties that you're looking for. There's a stereotype that autistic people don't have empathy, which is very, very, very much debunked. But even more has been understood in terms of what we call a double empathy problem. And so the idea is not that autistic people have no empathy. It's actually that neurotypical people also struggle to empathize with the autistic experience. It's a double empathy problem. And so we struggle to empathize with people whose way of processing the world is different from our own, and that works bidirectionally, right? And so it's not just a problem of not having it, it's actually a kind of universal experience of struggling to understand the perspective of someone who processes the world very differently. Okay, so that's the first criteria. Second is differences in nonverbal communication used for social interaction. So eye contact, that's such a classic that people are like, oh, that person can't have autism because they make excellent eye contact, right? This is one where you really want to ask about the internal experience. It's not just observing, wow, this person makes really easy eye contact, they're not autistic, right? When you ask an autistic person, what's the experience of eye contact like for you? They're much more likely to say something like, oh, I hate making eye contact. It's so awkward. It's so distracting. I have to, I've figured out that people think I'm not paying attention if I don't look at them. And so I've figured out a way to kind of like count to 3 as I'm making eye contact, and then I look away. But like, it's so distracting, right? Whereas you ask a neurotypical person, they're like, it's like, I don't know, it's fine. So you really want to ask about what it's like for them. It's not just, can they do it? Have they learned to do it? It's what's it like? Coordinating verbal and nonverbal communication. And so not just doing the gestures, but is it in response to, how we coordinate something's really important. And so we emphasize it with a nonverbal gesture or something like that. Detecting sarcasm, discerning metaphor, understanding other people's nonverbal cues. And so many, especially high maskers, know how to project a certain tone of voice that's expected of them, but can they understand the other person's tone of voice, what it means when it shifts? Coordinating the body with someone else's. This is a really interesting one to ask about. So do they kind of know how to come into a hug? Do they walk in step with someone? Do they have volume control? Do they stand too close? You may ask about kind of like, has anyone ever told you that you tend to stand too close or have poor body boundaries? Even, asking parents, what's it like walking next to them? Someone who has an autistic child may say, it's so funny you ask. They're always kind of like 5 steps ahead or 5 steps behind. They're kind of bumping into me. So weird, right? And this is all about kind of nonverbal communication of how we understand our body in relationship to other people's. You may also notice it different one-on-one versus in a group. And so maybe they can kind of hold it together when it's a one-on-one interaction, but you put someone in a group situation and suddenly it becomes so difficult to kind of perceive these differences in nonverbal communications. These are all things that you want to be asking about. Okay, so the last in this criterion is differences in developing, maintaining, and understanding, say, neurotypical relationships. So it has to do with social motivation. How much do you want to start interactions with other people, meet other people? Making and keeping friends is very important. And so it's not just, does this person have friends? It's how do they make friends? Maybe they're very adept at making friends, but you ask a little more about their social history and you come to understand that they've had a different friend every year, right? Where they can kind of keep it together up front, and then at some point it sort of falls apart and something happens in that friendship. And so asking about not just making friends, but keeping friends. And then sometimes it's the opposite, where someone, the moms got together in preschool and made that friendship for someone, and they've been able to keep that all throughout their life. But they've never made another friend, right, in adulthood, right? So it's not just, does this person have friends? Oh, they have friends, so they can't be autistic, right? It's what is the quality of those friendships, and differences in making and keeping friends. We also want to look at social flexibility. And so do they understand sort of changing social dynamics within different contexts? So that's talking to a teacher differently than you talk to your friend, right? That may be, interacting with different people in different contexts differently. It may also be, can you be socially flexible to let someone into your crowd who you don't really love, right? Or do you need your friend all to yourself and they glom onto you and you kind of have ownership in that relationship? And this is one where, especially in girls and women, we see a little more skill in this. And so it can be another thing that you may not perceive up front, but as you ask more about the internal experience, you start to see those traits emerge. Any questions about any of this criteria A stuff?
So for like masking, if autistic people have these sort of deficits, or I mean, not deficits, sorry, like differences where they just can't really understand like the neurotypical social cues and stuff. It's like, then how do they know like what exactly to mask, and like how do they know how to act?
Yeah, good question. Often through years of picking up on the data of what do people react well to, what do people not react so well to. You'll see a lot of people observing or reporting, like you can ask about if they watch movies and kind of watch people for how they interact, what they're supposed to say. They might script or kind of prepare something to be said ahead of time. And so they see a joke in a movie and they think it's really funny. And so they notice that people respond well to it, right? And so they memorize that joke and then use it in a social context, right? A lot of people may look at themselves in the mirror and kind of see, how does it look when I think something's funny? Am I responding in the way that I see other people respond, or does my face not really do that? Now I have to force myself into making that face. So this is often why it gets missed in people with average to higher intelligence, because they pick up on this stuff. They pick up on the data throughout the years of people thought that was weird. People seem to accept this. I'm watching this popular girl. They kind of do this, and emulating those characteristics.
Can you talk about the social flexibility, like versus like with an employer and then a friend? If you could elaborate more.
Yeah, like knowing the differences in maybe vocabulary that you would use in front of your employer versus with a friend. Knowing that maybe you don't share the partying that you did over the weekend with your employer, but maybe if a friend asks you how your weekend was, that's something you would dive into. And so knowing those differences of how you interact with different people and how you may adjust your social presentation based on what that person kind of expects of you may not be as intuitive for autistic people.
Could one lack versus like employer versus friends. Like you can be very social with friends, but lack that interaction with other people that you're not comfortable with.
It may be not knowing how to adjust that social context. And so they experience more success with friends, and then find that maybe relationships with employers are awkward because I don't know how to adjust the social context there.
Do you encourage the clients that you meet with to tell people that they're connecting with if they are on the spectrum?
It's a great question. That has a lot of philosophical implications about our society, right? That the reality is that we want to move in a direction where we're seeing this as a neutral difference in how the brain processes information. And the reality is that it is still stigmatized.
Yeah.
And so we really have to balance that difference. And it really is up to the individual of what's that individual relationship like. Does this feel like someone you can trust to divulge that information? Or do you see that being used against you? And it helps some people to maybe not use the autism label, but to say, I've noticed I focus a lot better when I'm in an environment that isn't so noisy. Is it okay if I bring in noise canceling headphones? Right. And so like talking to the traits and the needs as opposed to the label.
What specific testing do you do for to assess adult autism?
We will get to that. Mercy.
I was just wondering if these signs and things tend to differ with more intimate relationships versus like parent to child or like eye contact. Are they, is an autistic person generally more able to maintain eye contact with their spouse versus friends? So it can differ.
Yeah. So the question was about being able to adjust kind of like masking or more neurotypical traits with people who are more comfortable. And that may be the case.
Is it still masked? Does it come more naturally?
It may come more naturally, right?
Okay.
When there are fewer other anxieties, it may feel more comfortable to make eye contact. It may be that in most relationships, eye contact feels really, really intimate, but with someone trusted, it doesn't feel that self-conscious. I'm going to move on to criteria B. Maybe. Which is restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And so the first is stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. And so this may be referred to as stimming. We have kind of what people think of as like the stereotypical stimming, which is things like hand flapping, body rocking, lining up toys, repeating others' speech, which we call echolalia. We also really want to ask and be attuned to things that we may not think of as stims, like pacing, tapping your fingers or feet, chewing on a shirt, skin picking, hair twirling, reading the same book or watching the same movie, even drawing the same thing repetitively, sucking on candy, smelling scented candles, staring at a lava lamp. And so you see how this integrates all 5 senses. And really important to reconceptualize these things, not as weird, but as really important ways that autistic people regulate, express emotion, manage anxiety. And so all people stim to some extent, right? It's why fidget spinners are so popular. But autistic people do it more repetitively, more intensely, more frequently. Right? So the second one, and I should mention, DSM-wise, you need 2 of these 4 to meet criteria. So you need all 3 of the communication and relationship ones, 2 of the 4 of criteria B. Okay, so preference for sameness, adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal and nonverbal behavior. And so difficulty adjusting to a change in environment, plan, routine. You may hear people who their parents painted their house and they just can't deal. They have a really hard time if somebody rearranges something in their room. A change in the plan really throws them off. I had one client who talked about how, like, if he and his friends are planning on watching a movie and they all hang out and then they're starting to kind of like talk and, the movie ends up not, kind of going into the background. he'll bring up like, are we going to watch the movie? Because that was the plan. Even if he didn't even want to watch the movie, even maybe he's enjoying kind of like just talking. He noticed that he's always like, okay, when are we watching the movie? Even though he like doesn't even want to watch the movie, but that was the plan. And so we have to stick to the plan. You can ask about kind of what's it like if you were supposed to go to dinner with your parents and all of a sudden they can't. What's that like for you? And there's a really big difference between like, oh, that's frustrating, I don't love it, versus like, I start to really feel like things are breaking down. So, preferring routine, liking to eat the same thing every day, doing tasks in the same order, taking the same route to work. There may be a hyperfixation on activities, and so kind of repeating, doing the same thing over and over, struggling with shifting from one task to another, excessive rule following. This is definitely something, parents reflecting back. My child was an angel. I was like, they were a little too angelic, right? Like, did they know how to bend the rules a little bit? Thinking about black and white, all or nothing thinking kind of falls into this, as well as being literal.
Good question, Joe.
Yeah.
How would you separate those qualities from people with OCD or people experiencing the same qualities of obsessiveness?
Yeah.
They're the same.
They can, but it's all of these other qualities that we're seeing with autism, right? And so being able to seeing all of these autistic traits is very different than someone who just obsesses and compulsives.
That might be shared between.
Very much so.
So you might see like very, very similar traits and then the extra context.
Exactly. Yeah.
How about divorce?
How about divorce? Tell me more.
What do you see when teenager sees his parents divorced, everything changes.
Mhm.
And I just had a conversation with
Mm.
parents that after that happened, he exhibited a lot of negative behavior.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is where we talk about that spectrum, right? Where something shifts and all of a sudden the predictability is removed. And that's, something to really take into account here, that this is a very understandable thing, that in a world where everything feels chaotic, everything feels unpredictable, the stability that repetition and routine provide is so key to making it in this world. And when you take away that routine, suddenly it all falls apart, right? Okay, so the third, maybe, what we call special interests. And so caring deeply and passionately about a topic of interest, being really knowledgeable about that area, can be a primary way of making sense of the world. For autistic people, that interest is kind of their touch point, their way of understanding the world. And it's different from a hobby, right? It's not just something they happen to do. It really is part of identity. They're spending their downtime learning about the topic, thinking about the topic, figuring out how they can integrate it into conversation. You may hear people who say, I figured out that people don't want to hear about farm animals all the time. And so I don't bring it up, but if they bring it up, then it's fair game and I'm all in. Preferring to talk about that interest over other topics. And it really has a calming effect. It's their way of kind of making sense of the world. They may really struggle to transition away from that interest. Once they're in, it's really hard to diverge out. And you may hear that it's interfering with things like sleep, work, school, social obligations. Parents may comment on it. Parents may be able to reflect back on, oh yeah, they had their Lego phase and then they had their dinosaur phase and then they had, and so you're kind of looking for that sort of pattern. The fourth is hyporeactivity to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. And so that may be attention to visual details, noises, smells, textures that exceptionally bother, distract, or soothe, right? You may have people who actually seek out certain textures or smells or noises that help them kind of filter out all of the buzz in the world. And so you may find people who report sensitivity to clothing. Parents may say, oh yeah, they never allowed me to give them socks that had seams. I always had to cut the tags out of their clothing. This is a really big one for subjective experience. You want to ask the individual, what is it like for you to be in a crowd, to be in a noisy environment? Because again, this is the type of thing that they may cover up. They may not complain. They may not tell anyone because they've realized they get negative feedback for doing so, but it's there. This also has to do with, you may see something that looked like a phobia, like they're afraid of a public restroom, but really it's not liking the sound of all the toilets flushing at the same time, right? It may look like poor hygiene, but actually it's, I don't like the feeling of getting my hair wet, right? Very different. Even asking about pain tolerance. We often see autistic people have a really high pain tolerance because it's like that hyporeceptivity. And also potentially issues with what we call interoception, being able to perceive your internal experience. So knowing when you're hungry, knowing when you're thirsty, needing to go to the bathroom, etc. So, and then, criteria C is that, these have to have been present from an early phase of life. D is that it impacts life in some way. But these are kind of your main criteria. Other considerations that are not in the DSM, but things that kind of get the spidey senses thinking. Very often we get sensitive gut and GI issues. People who are gender diverse are 3 to 6 times more likely to be autistic. And you may hear about the experience of meltdowns and shutdowns. And so that's kind of sensory overwhelm that results in what may look like a tantrum, but it's not being used to change behavior in any way. It's just a complete lack of loss of control that may look like shouting, growling, crying, kicking, flapping, or shutdown, completely having to withdraw. So how do we look for this? So we want to engage in effort testing. I think a good clinical interview is everything here. You're really wanting to talk through all of those aspects that I just outlined. I think it's really important to review records. If you can get report cards, sometimes you get little hints here and there from teachers making comments about things that parents didn't think were important way back when, but you start to see the puzzle kind of come together. You may even see previous neuropsych reports. Someone may bring up a sensory sensitivity or something like that wasn't really regarded then, but is important. We want to talk to other people in the person's life. And so if we can interview a parent, if we can interview a partner, all good things. And then we do use neuropsych assessments. And so here's kind of a sample battery of what that might look like. I am partial to the MIGDAS as kind of a primary assessment tool. It's an interview, like a structured interview that looks at different areas and really asks about a lot of the questions that I brought up through that diagnostic criteria. We want to use a structured informant interview potentially. And so the MIGDAS has a parent version. There's also a more diagnostic parent interview called the ADIR. Really cool self-report measures are out there these days. So the CAT-Q, for example, is the Camouflaging Autism Traits questionnaire. And it kind of talks through those things that we talked about of like, do you find yourselves looking to movies to understand how to interact in social situations? Do you find yourself practicing what you're going to say? So it kind of looks at that masking and assesses for that. The RAD similarly asks about like, I do this now versus I did this age 16 or before. And so it's able to kind of like reflect previously on, was this hard, even if it's maybe not hard now. The social responsiveness questionnaire also kind of looks at social motivation, things like that within the social domain. And then something to consider is doing sort of performance measures. There's one called the social cognition part of the advanced clinical solutions from Weschler. And it gives them faces and they have to name the emotion that's being expressed. It has people like say things in a certain tone of voice and they have to give the meaning of that. And, you know, high maskers may be able to do this, but you can, like, the behavioral observations are so interesting here, where you may see them really struggling to kind of like put it together or take a guess, essentially, versus people for whom it comes really intuitively. Barriers to successful identification may be letting prior diagnoses explain too much. And so a clinician may say, oh, they have social anxiety disorder, so of course they struggle with friendships, or they have ADHD, so of course they're getting distracted when there's a lot of noise, right? We don't want to let previous diagnoses explain too much. And then kind of similarly, like what Jake brought up, we got a lot of overlap with other diagnostic categories. So we really want to look for how all of these traits kind of come together and not allow it to be explained away by other diagnostic categories. We want to be really careful about not letting neurotypical behaviors rule out autism. Just because someone has friends, just because they make good eye contact, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be thinking about, could autism be at play here? We don't want to rely too much on one measure. And the biggest one really is not asking about subjective internal experience. It's not just about the behaviors that someone is showing, but what's it like for them to demonstrate those behaviors? And lastly, thinking about neurodiversity-affirmative feedback, really thinking about autism as a disability, not a disorder, right? That it's disabling to be autistic in a neurotypical world, but your brain is not disordered because it processes the world differently. And so giving feedback about finding a therapy provider who helps someone navigate, when are you masking? When are you not? Are there situations where you can be your authentic self? And how do we create more of those situations to mitigate burnout? Avoiding behavioral approaches that are focused on kind of like training to be neurotypical, right? And big emphasis on finding community. That's so much of success living as an autistic person in a neurotypical world, is finding other people who think similarly. And so finding people who share their special interests, who love to just talk to each other about their interests all day, who are okay if I'm over here cooking and you're also over here cooking and we don't have to be talking, but we can just kind of do the same thing in the same space, right? So finding people whose neurotype sort of aligns with your own can be a really, really big way of functioning. And so emphasizing that and hoping for that is a big part of feedback. And that is all. So we have some time for questions.
Can you explain a little of the difference between being diagnosed with level 1 autism or level 2?
Yes, and there is a level 3. So again, yes, repeating the question for Zoom. The question was about levels within the DSM. And so we have diagnosing levels 1, 2, and 3. This really is about support needs. And so it's, you know, how much support does this person need to navigate the world? This is one of those kind of DSM trying to minimize an experience in a way that is perhaps not appropriate for understanding the full social context or the full context of someone's experience. But it's what we have right now to try to assign appropriate support to someone who needs it. And so it is about how much support does this person need to navigate the world.
How about use of substances?
Use of substances, very common with autism. It can be a way of kind of drowning out the anxiety that comes from navigating a social context. All of the the calculations and the sort of bottom-up processing that we were talking about can be mitigated through substance use. And so it may be a way to kind of drown that out. Or on the flip side, a way to feel something in some way. And so something we do see a lot.
How do you deal with it?
Finding more effective ways of coping, right? I'm seeing it as it's a way of coping, of mitigating the stresses of existing in a neurotypical world. And so finding other ways where maybe you don't have to dampen that social anxiety because you're surrounding yourself with community that you feel you can be your authentic self with.
I've learned in a lot of my like psych classes that a lot of disorders can be affected by both genetics and environment. And I know that you said that autism is genetically heritable, but I was wondering if there are any environmental influences that can kind of impact the development of autism, like parenting or things like that.
Yeah. So we're asking about the confluence of genetics and environment. And I think this is more one of those things that the sort of like obviousness of traits is going to be very highly impacted by experiences. And so people who, for example, are, parents go through a divorce, right? And their whole world changes. And all of a sudden you see kind of the structures that they've created breaking down, and you might see these traits come out a little more obviously. That's where I think the expression of those traits may be more obvious, but this is something neurodevelopmental that, is there from the start. And so, yeah, I think, less impacted there.
Yeah. You guys just focus on like not pathologizing like certain things. So why is autism something that we like choose to pathologize, and how do we know when we should pathologize something and when we should?
That's it. So it's about kind of diagnostic labels and pathologizing. And I think this comes around the idea of how do we define autism in the first place? And homosexuality was in the DSM many years ago, right? And it's something that we've come to understand not as a disorder, but as a difference. And that's where the field sees autism moving as well, is this idea that this actually isn't a disorder. It's a neurological difference that we will come to accept as a natural variation in the human experience, as opposed to a disorder. And so, and it can be really affirming to understand one's identity as autistic, because it then becomes about, okay, I process the world differently. And so I need to balance how much I'm going to be in a situation where I have to mask all day, balance a sensory situation, prepare for a situation that's going to be stressful, versus seeing it as I'm just this like overly sensitive person who just doesn't get things. So it can be really helpful to understand that identity versus pathologizing the label.
I think just to kind of piggyback off that,
Yeah.
I think it's important for accommodations
Yeah.
as well. Like until the world catches up,
Yeah.
we like need it
Yeah.
for accommodations.
Yeah, that is the reality too of, anything really in the DSM is that for insurance, we need it, for accommodations, we need it. And this is kind of, similar to a world that is better without patriarchal systems. A world is better without ableism, right? And so, yeah, autistic people do better in a classroom where they are able to record a lecture and listen to it later, but maybe we all are, right? And so can we adjust those accommodations to suit everyone?
This is kind of a specific question, but speaking toward the accommodation issue, I've seen often high school kids who have not been officially diagnosed, but they have some traits, and the family may be wondering, but their lives are manageable. They've been able to get accommodations at their school because teachers have been sympathetic and helpful. Then they're ready to go to college, do they need the diagnosis and do they need neuropsych testing to support their patients in college? Yeah. They kind of do that,
Often,
like,
yeah.
4-year window of have to have this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
that's
the,
still true.
yeah. So
Okay.
the question is about accommodations that maybe kind of worked out earlier in life, but needing an official diagnosis maybe to move into college and receive accommodations there. And unfortunately, the answer is yes.
That's still true.
Right.
Some of the people in my life who I've met who have autism are some of the most like pure-hearted, genuine,
Yeah.
kind, selfless
Mhm.
people, and I was curious if there's like any reason why.
Yeah, I think so question about people with autism being like genuine, kind-hearted, and kind of why that might be. And part of it is sort of like avoiding the social niceties and just being authentic and honest and coming at the world with a lot of intention. And so I think a big piece of it is kind of like not really preferring superficiality and really liking depth of connection and honesty and transparency. And honestly, that's kind of what we're all looking for at the end of the day. I think, you know, we like this idea of if I put up a front and I'm perfect, people will like me. But people like authenticity at the end of the day. And often autistic people are more in touch with what is authentic or feel less pressure to not share that. And that can be where we see that goodness shine through.
So I had a clinician tell me that people on the spectrum do not lie. So just so I can explain it to a friend, can you explain what that means?
Yeah. When you think about it, lying requires a lot of social skill. It requires being able to perspective take, to think, how would this person perceive what I'm saying? Is there something inherently wrong with what I'm saying? Or did I do the thing that I did because I thought it was the right thing to do at the time? And there's no shame in that, right? And so number one, the skill of like, how do I navigate a lie may be much more challenging, but also even perceiving that lying may be beneficial, maybe less present.
Avoidance, maybe, like, or probably. Like, I don't know, I think sometimes if a person on the spectrum lies, it's to avoid something that they're not trying to do.
Sure, yeah. And it may be harder for them to navigate that lie of like keeping it consistent or
Yeah.
being able to perspective take of like what someone else is going to see as realistic. And so that's where you may see that less likely to come out.
Thank you so much, Jen.
Sorry,
She'll be here.
I'll be here.
Like, end it. Just a couple of housekeeping pieces. Thank you, everybody, for being here. If you need your CEUs and you are signed up through CE.go, you just log in through your dashboard, whether you attended virtually or in person. It's all on your dashboard, and you'll need to just fill out a couple of survey questions, and then it'll populate your certificate and send it to you via email as well as on your dashboard.
Is that
yeah.
on the dashboard? Because I'm not signed up with that though.
You're not? Okay, we can get you signed up before you head out.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, no problem. And yeah, let's give Jen one more big round of applause.
Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. And like Kelly said, I'm here.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you, everybody who joined us virtually.
Yes, thank you.
Great news.
Before some of that good stuff, you know,
Yeah. Maybe I can use it for. I like the way you broke it down.
Cool. Yeah. Share.
Talking to you soon.